Hello and welcome back. I'm excited to have you watching today. Today we are making the next block in our Sunny Patches block of the month, and it is this Sunny square in a square block. I've made it here using my Beautiful Day line of fabric, and I'm going to walk you through making one using my Sunwashed line of fabric. So far in this sew along, we've made a number of blocks. We started with the Greek cross. We went to the 1941 block, followed by the Friendship Star block. And our very first block that we made was the jelly roll block. We're using these for the setting squares in our final layout. So we're making a lot of these. So that is 4 different blocks total, 3 mystery blocks plus the jelly roll block, with today being the 4th mystery block and the 5th block overall. If you have missed any of these blocks, I do have all of them linked in the description box below so that you can catch up, join in at any time, or maybe you are just swamped with sew-alongs right now. I know there's so many good ones going on. You can always print the patterns out and save them for a rainy day, or maybe when you want to pick up another sew-along. So let's just get started. This is what the pattern looks like. Again, it's a free pattern. It's available over on my blog, corianderquilts.com, and I have this linked in the description box. Go ahead and print out your copy and then get your A through H pieces cut. You can see I have all of my pieces cut here for this block, and we are going to be making a lot of square in a square patches. I know square in a squares sometimes don't work out for everybody, so I'm going to share how I make my square in a squares. I have talked about this technique before. I don't know that it's anything special, but it's the way that I do it. If you have a different technique that you like to use to construct these units, by all means, go ahead and do so. There are a lot of different ways that we can make these, different tools that we can use, different techniques, and I always encourage you to use whatever method works best for you and gets you the results that you want. To begin with, we are going to be making this very center. You see it here, the center of our block, this right here. And to do that, we will be using our A square, and then we are using 4 of our E squares. Now, if you are opting for the simplified block each month, we do have that option. You could skip making this center square in a square, and you would end up with a solid square in a square. That would at least eliminate one of those units and would simplify the block just a little bit. Of course, if you want to practice your square in a square units, this is a great time to do so. Now, I have already marked my E squares with a diagonal line across the back of each of them. And what we'll do, the way I always do these, I'm kind of old school when it comes to square in a squares, is I use the stitch and flip method, that snowball corner sort of technique, and I will have my diagonal line running from the top right to the bottom left. I will take this to my sewing machine, sew right on that line, and then before I trim anything out, I press. After I've sewn, I press, and I want to make sure that my sewing has been accurate, that I have sewn from corner to corner, and that everything matches up very nicely when I press this out. I'm going to sew one of these, this corner and the bottom corner, and show you how I want it to look before I trim anything out. It's just so easy to make sure that you're accurate when you sew, press, and then trim. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm back with my little unit. Now what I did is I sewed one side properly and I sewed the other side not great on purpose so that I could show you what happens if I were to trim before I press. So let me hold this up so you can see. So this side here, everything lines up whoops, not this side. This side here, everything lines up very nicely. This is how I want this to look after it's pressed. I want it to be the exact same size as it was before I sewed anything on. So I don't want any overhang on the back. I don't want any shortness or overhang on the front. Now, this piece down here, I purposely sewed it wrong. And all I had to do was go just a little bit away from that marked diagonal line. I don't know how well you can see my marked diagonal, but I just purposely didn't sew quite from corner to corner. And then I pressed it, and now you can see right here on this edge, it does not go to the edge. And over on the other side, we're having the same problem. My top pressing, when I have it pressed over, does not meet the outside edge. And I want this to be exactly the same when it's folded and pressed on top. And we can see that it's not. Now, if I had just sewn that and then cut my 1/4 inch seam allowance, many times patterns will tell you sew and then cut and then press. And if you do that, you have no way of knowing. Well, you might be able to see that your seam isn't quite where you want it to, but sometimes we're not off by a little bit, and it really affects how our block turns out quite a bit. So it's much easier to see the inaccuracies if you press first, and then you can make adjustments to that if you need to. So now all I need to do is go up. I'm just going to seam rip that and sew it accurately, press it, make sure everything lines up just like this side does, and then I go ahead and I trim out my 1/4 inch seam on those back 2 layers. And then we will end up with a unit that measures exactly what we wanted to. This square started out at 3.5 inches, and we want it to end up at 3.5 inches after we have sewn all of our stitch and flip corners to those edges. So I will go seam rip that, fix this unit, and then trim out those bottom 2 layers. Then the next thing that I will do, grab 2 more squares, and I'm going to repeat on the remaining 2 corners. Exactly the same way. I will line everything up, sew on those marked diagonals, press out, make sure everything lines up perfectly, and then trim out those bottom 2 layers. I'm going to do that for the center, but as you read down through the pattern, you're going to see that we also are going to be using our C squares and our B squares to make these stitch and flip corners here. So I am going to go ahead and chain piece those at the same time. When you look at the pattern, you're going to see that you will use C, B, and then you will also use some E squares because we are using 2 different fabrics for our stitch and flip corners on these 4 outer square and a square blocks. You can see that illustrated here in your pattern. Let's go ahead and get those square and a squares done, and then we'll move on to the next step. I am just finishing up these square and a squares by trimming out my bottom 2 layers. I oftentimes just do this with the scissors, especially for a block this size. And so you can see there's my center, and these are the units that are going to go around the center patches. And they just need trimmed out yet. Now, when you are making your square and a squares, if you find that after you have sewn and pressed that this top piece is consistently shorter, it doesn't quite meet the edge of your patch, you are going to want to sew just a hair, just a thread's width to the right side of your drawn line as you are sewing your top unit to your bottom. And that is going to give you just a little more room so that that lines up very nicely. We don't realize, but even depending on the type of thread that we use, some threads are a little bit bulkier than other threads, that thread takes up space in our seam allowances. And so if we're using a little bit of a heavier weight thread, we might find that sewing just on the outside edge, not very much, but just sewing on the outside edge of that drawn line will eliminate those being just a little bit too short. I mentioned that this is the technique that I primarily use for my square and a square units, but I will also sometimes use this square and a square foundation paper. This is an It's Soema product. I'll link to it in the description box below. If you're not familiar with this product, it is paper that you sew onto, and it makes very accurate square and a square units. It's a really nice resource to know is available to you. And there are also really nice tutorials that show you how to use this paper, so I'll be sure and link to those as well. The size that you would need for this specific block, you do need different sized papers for different sized units. You would want the 3-inch square and a square paper. You can read down here that that is a 3.5-inch square unfinished block. So when you're looking at your pattern, you can see here in step 5, for example, that at this stage of the game, these are measuring 3.5 inches. That is the unfinished measurement, and so you want the 3.5-inch unfinished square and a square paper, or 3-inch finished, which is what these will finish at once our block is done. So just another nice resource. And again, so many different ways that we can make these square and a square units. If you've got a favorite that you want to be sure everybody is aware of, I know there are lots of different rulers. I've tried a lot of different rulers and papers and just different ways that we can make these. If you have a favorite way, you can leave it in the comments below. It's so nice to have that resource, especially for those of us that might be new to piecing blocks. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our next step. I have my 1 center, and then I have 4 of these outside patches done. The next thing that I want to do is step 6, that is to sew my E and my D squares together. You should have 4 E's and 4 D's. We're just going to sew these 2 together. And again, you're always going to find pressing instructions listed in all of my patterns, so you can easily see how we are pressing everything. But we are going to sew these together, going to press towards D. Once you have sewn those together into 4 pairs, just like this, then you're going to sew F to the bottom of that unit, and that's going to get pressed towards F. We're going to make 4 of these units, just like you see here in the pattern, and then we're ready to start assembling our block. Here is what our block layout is going to look like. I've completed those 4 corners that I just sewed up. This is what the pressing looks like on those. And we are just going to sew this together in horizontal rows. As you are pressing these, the top row and the bottom row get pressed away from the center. The center row gets pressed towards the center. And then you can see once you are sewing together the rows, you are going to press those final 2 long seams away from the center. After completing the center portion of the block, we are going to add our G rectangles to the sides of the block. Those get pressed away from the center, and then we will sew our H rectangles to the top and bottom. Again, we are going to press those away from the center. And we have 1 completed Sunny square and a square block. As I was just finishing this block up, I was sewing and thinking about how I never use any pins when I am sewing my blocks. Well, very seldom do I use any pins. So I didn't use any pins when I piece this. I'll sometimes use pins on small blocks if they're being fussy and not wanting to do what they're supposed to. And it made me wonder how many of you are also, let's not pin unless we absolutely have to, because that is where I fall. I don't pin unless I've got a block that's putting up a fight, and then I might have to get out my pins. Are any of you the same way, or are you, we must pin everything sort of people? It's always curious and interesting to me how different we all are when we approach quilt making, and yet it all seems to sort of work out. We find our techniques that work best for us and piece blocks in a way that we enjoy and just have a good time doing it. All right, let's just continue on with this block. But that's what I was thinking about during my last couple seams. So let me know. I want to show you the back of this block here, talk about the pressing a little bit so you can see how everything is pressed. Now you are going to have a little bit of bulk where these seams come together if you press the same way that I did. I think the block turned out beautifully even with that bulk, but if you wanted to eliminate some of that, you could opt to press your square and a square blocks open. Press all the seams open for those. I mentioned I am a not pinning sort of gal. I am also a not pressing seams open sort of gal. So I will press to the side if the block works well pressed to the side. But some of you might find that you would like to press those open. I know when I read down through my comments, I have a number of you that prefer to press everything open. So if you're in that camp, you might find that you like to press those open. one thing I want to mention with my technique of doing those stitch and flip corners. So we sew, we press, and then we trim. And then if I wanted to press open, I would do that as my final step. So I would follow the steps exactly as I laid them out at the beginning of the video, and then my final step would be to go back and press those seams open. So you would sew on your diagonal line, press out, making sure that everything lines up nicely, and then trim your bottom 2 layers, leaving that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then as a final step, you would press that seam open. Repeat that for all of your stitch and flip corners. That's the way that I would do those if I were pressing those open. And I find that method to work very nicely and give me nice accurate results. So those are the 2 blocks. Beautiful day and Sunwashed, ready to go for this month. If you have any questions about anything I talked about, be sure to let me know. And again, I've got everything linked down below so that you have access to the pattern. I'm going to link the square and a square paper I talked about, that tutorial I mentioned for this paper. And if there's any other questions that you might have, be sure to let me know. Have fun sewing your block up, and I'll catch you again next time.